A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was staring at a $15 keyboard on my shelf yesterday, Herman, and I realized I've spent the last 3 years moving it from one box to another simply because it still works. It is a Logitech K20, the basic wired workhorse of the computing world. It is made of black plastic. It has that specific membrane mushiness we all know. And for some reason, the idea of putting a functional tool into a trash bag felt like a personal failure of character. It felt like I was portraying the very concept of utility.
I am Herman Poppleberry, and I know that exact feeling of paralysis. It is the classic trap of the functional object. If it were broken, if the cable were frayed or the spacebar was stuck, you would toss it into the recycling bin without a second thought. But because it can still register a keystroke, because it still possesses the potential to be useful, it occupies a permanent high-rent space in your mental inventory. You aren't just storing a keyboard, you are storing the possibility of a keyboard, and that possibility is surprisingly heavy.
Today's prompt from Daniel is about this very struggle, what he calls the altruistic tax of decluttering. He is grappling with the tension between wanting to be sustainable or helpful by finding a good home for old gear, like those keyboards or old microphones, versus the massive time cost and the sheer soul-crushing tedium of actually making that handoff happen. Daniel is a guy who values efficiency. He's into open source and automation, and yet he's found himself stuck in this manual, high-friction loop of trying to be a good person with his old tech.
Daniel is hitting on a deep psychological friction point here. We often frame decluttering as a simple logistical task. You have a thing, you don't want the thing, you move the thing. But there is a massive cognitive and emotional load attached to the disposal of functional items. It is especially heavy when you live somewhere like Israel, where Daniel is, because as he pointed out in his message, getting specific tech models into the country can be a literal battle with customs and shipping logistics. When you have fought for an item, when you've tracked it across 3 continents and argued with a customs official over the import tax, letting it go feels like surrendering a hard-won trophy.
It turns the item into a monument of your past effort. But the reality is that the effort you spent 3 years ago to get that microphone through customs is a sunk cost. It has zero bearing on the utility of the microphone today, yet we let it weigh down our current decision-making. I want to dig into this concept of the altruistic tax because it is such a perfect way to describe that hidden fee we pay in hours of our lives just to avoid the guilt of a landfill. We are essentially subsidizing the greenness of our conscience with our most non-renewable resource, our time.
The math of the altruistic tax is actually quite brutal when you break it down, Corn. Let's do a quick audit. If you value your time at, say, $50 an hour, which for a skilled professional like Daniel is probably a conservative estimate, and you spend 2 hours taking photos of a $10 keyboard, writing a description for a local Buy Nothing group, responding to 3 different people asking if it's still available, and then waiting at home for a pickup that may or may not happen, you have essentially paid $90 for the privilege of feeling like a good person. You have spent $100 of time value to save a $10 item from a landfill. From a purely economic standpoint, you are burning a $100 bill to save a $10 bill.
And that is assuming the person actually shows up. We've all been there, Herman. You're waiting for the person from the internet who said they were coming at 4 o'clock to pick up the free blender or the old webcam. No, it is 5:30. Your afternoon is short. You haven't been able to go for your walk or play with your kids because you're on call for a stranger, and the item is still sitting by the door mocking you. It's a form of social contract that is constantly being breached, and we are the ones paying the penalty.
That is the peak of the headache tax we discussed back in episode 655. In a high-friction service environment, the simple act of giving something away becomes a complex logistical project. In Israel specifically, the culture of second-hand exchange is very active, but it is also incredibly chaotic. There is a lot of back and forth on messaging apps, vague directions, and the inevitable haggling even when the item is listed as free. People will literally haggle over the cost of driving to your house to pick up a free item. It's a bizarre inversion of value.
Why is it so much harder to throw away a working item than a broken one? I mean, from a physical footprint perspective, they are identical. They both take up the same square footage on the shelf. They both gather the same amount of dust. Why does my brain treat the working K20 keyboard like a sacred relic and the broken one like trash?
It comes down to a few core cognitive biases that are hardwired into our evolutionary biology. First, there's the endowment effect. Research consistently shows that we value objects roughly 1.5 to 2 times more simply because we own them. We imbue them with our own history and potential. When an item still has utility, our brains perceive it as having unrealized value. Tossing it feels like destroying value, which triggers a pain response in the brain similar to losing actual money. Your brain isn't seeing a $15 keyboard, it's seeing a loss of $15 plus the loss of the potential work that keyboard could do.
So we are essentially trying to avoid that micro pang of loss by offloading the value realization onto someone else. We want to say, I did not waste this. Look, someone else is using it. But we ignore the fact that the search for that someone else is costing us more than the item is worth. It's a form of moral laundering. We want to clean the waste off our hands by putting it into someone else's, regardless of the cost to our own sanity.
And there is a secondary effect called the responsibility trap. We feel a moral obligation to ensure the item reaches its highest and best use. If I have a high-quality condenser microphone that I am not using, my brain tells me that it belongs in the hands of a struggling podcaster or a student. If I put it in the bin, I am not just throwing away plastic and metal, I am throwing away the opportunity for that student to create something. That is a heavy burden to carry for a piece of consumer electronics. We've turned ourselves into the curators of our own personal museums of things that could be useful to someone else.
It is a form of moral perfectionism. We are trying to optimize for the entire universe instead of optimizing for our own living room. And for someone like Daniel, who is deeply involved in technical systems, that desire for efficiency and proper resource allocation is probably even stronger. He sees a functional tool and thinks, this system is inefficient if this tool is not being utilized. He's looking at his house like a giant cash miss in a CPU.
The problem, Daniel, is that the system includes your own bandwidth. If you are spending your Saturday morning responding to WhatsApp messages about a keyboard instead of playing with your son Ezra or working on a new project with your wife Hannah, the system is actually losing more value than the keyboard could ever provide. We have to start including our own mental clear space as a resource in this equation. Your attention is a non-renewable resource. The keyboard is a mass-produced commodity.
I think about the move Daniel and Hannah made, which we touched on in episode 854. Moving house in Israel is already a high-stress event. The logistics are intense. The apartments are often smaller than what you'd find in the suburbs of the US, and every box you move costs you money and physical effort. If you are carrying around boxes of functional but unused gear because you haven't found the perfect recipient yet, you are literally paying a physical tax in moving costs and a mental tax in clutter. You are paying rent on things you don't even use.
There is a real cognitive load to every item you own. Each object is a silent request for your attention. It needs to be stored, it needs to be cleaned, it needs to be moved, or it eventually needs to be dealt with. When you have a stack of old tech, your brain is constantly running a background process that says, I need to do something about those microphones. That background process eats up RAM that could be used for creativity, focus, or just being present. It's like having 50 browser tabs open and 45 of them are just ads for things you already bought.
So how do we quantify this? How do we decide when an item has crossed the line from a valuable asset to a liability that needs to be purged regardless of its utility? How do we give Daniel a framework that lets him hit delete on these items without the crushing guilt?
I like to use a minimum value threshold for any kind of individual listing or coordination. For me, if an item's market value is less than 1 hour of my billable rate, it does not get a dedicated post on a marketplace. It does not get a free to a good home listing. It goes into a batch. Batching is the only way to lower the altruistic tax to a level that makes sense. If your time is worth $50 an hour and the keyboard is worth $15, you are already $35 in the hole the moment you pick up your phone to take a photo of it.
Explain the batching process, because I think people struggle with the all or nothing choice between the trash can and the individual handoff. They feel like if they don't find a specific person for the specific item, they've failed.
You have to create a single exit system. You have a single box in your house labeled the donation bin. When you find an item like that K20 keyboard, it goes into the box immediately. You do not think about who needs it. You do not research its current eBay price. You do not take a photo of it. You just put it in the box. Once the box is full, and only when it is full, you take the entire box to a single drop-off point. This could be a charity shop, a community center, or a dedicated recycling center that handles functional goods. You are collapsing 20 individual logistical headaches into one single trip. You are paying the altruistic tax once for 20 items instead of 20 times for 20 items.
That sounds great in theory, but what about the items that are a bit more niche, like a specific condenser microphone that a general charity shop might not even know how to price or give away? It feels like a waste to put a $200 microphone in a box with a bunch of old t-shirts. Does that go in the bin too?
This is where the replacement cost threshold comes in. You have to ask yourself, if I needed this exact item again in 6 months, how much would it cost me in money and time to get it back? If the answer is $20 and a trip to the local store, you should not be storing it. The cost of storing that item for 6 months, in terms of the space it occupies and the mental energy it drains, is often higher than the $20 it would take to replace it. Now, if it's a rare, out-of-print piece of gear that took you a year to find, that's different. But for 99% of consumer electronics, the replacement cost is lower than the storage cost.
That is a hard pill to swallow for anyone who grew up with a waste not, want not mentality. My grandfather would have kept every single screw and scrap of wood because you never know when you might need it. But he also lived in a world where you could not get a replacement delivered to your door in 24 hours. He lived in a world of scarcity. We live in a world of manufactured abundance.
We are living in an era of extreme abundance for certain types of goods and extreme scarcity for high-quality time. The economics have flipped. In the past, the item was the scarce resource, so it made sense to spend time preserving it. Today, your attention is the scarce resource, and the plastic keyboard is the abundant one. Treating the keyboard as if it is scarce is a category error. You are using a 1950s survival strategy in a 2026 digital economy.
Daniel mentioned the sunk cost of the effort to acquire things in Israel. I want to go back to that because it is a very specific pain. If you spend 3 weeks tracking a package through the Israel Post system, which we know can be a black hole, and then you had to drive to a remote distribution center and pay an unexpected customs fee, that item feels like it is made of gold. You've bled for that microphone.
It is a form of trauma bonding with your electronics. You suffered for that microphone, so you feel like you are betraying your past self by getting rid of it. You feel like you're saying your past effort was worthless. But we have to realize that the suffering is over. Keeping the item does not retroactively make the customs battle any easier. In fact, keeping it might be extending the battle by cluttering your life. You are letting a ghost from 3 years ago dictate how you use your shelf space today.
There is a psychological trick I use sometimes. I imagine I am a professional consultant hired to optimize my own office. If I were looking at someone else's shelves and saw 3 old microphones and 5 basic keyboards, I would tell them to clear it out immediately. It is much easier to be objective about someone else's clutter, because you do not have the emotional baggage of the acquisition. You don't remember the customs forms, you just see the dust.
That is actually a recognized technique in professional organizing. They call it the stranger test. If a stranger walked into your room and offered you $10 for this box of old cables, would you take it? If the answer is yes, then the item is not worth the space it is taking up. Most of the time, we are holding on to things because of the friction of disposal, not the value of the object. We aren't keeping the keyboard because we love it. We're keeping it because we hate the process of getting rid of it.
Let's talk about the environmental guilt. I think that is the biggest driver of the altruistic tax for people like Daniel. We feel that by throwing something away, we are personally responsible for the degradation of the planet. We see the plastic, and we see the landfill, and we feel a weight of global responsibility.
This is a heavy one, but we have to be realistic about the scale. The environmental impact of a single keyboard is largely determined at the point of manufacture and shipping. Once it is in your house, the carbon footprint is mostly spent. Whether it sits on your shelf for 10 years and then goes to a landfill or goes to a landfill today, the long-term environmental outcome is very similar. The most sustainable thing you can do is to buy less in the future, not to hoard the mistakes of the past.
That is a really important distinction. Sustainability happens at the checkout counter, not at the trash can. If you are already at the point where you have an item you do not need, the environmental damage is done. Trying to mitigate that damage by spending 5 hours of your life finding a recipient is often a poor trade-off for the planet too, especially if you are driving across town in a combustion engine car to deliver a $5 item.
The carbon footprint of your car trip to deliver that free keyboard might actually be higher than the environmental cost of the keyboard itself. We tend to ignore the second-order effects of our altruism. We focus on the visible act of giving and ignore the invisible costs of the logistics. If you want to help the planet, stay home, throw the keyboard away, and use those 2 saved hours to advocate for better right-to-repair laws or donate to a high-impact climate charity. That is a much more efficient use of your altruism budget.
I also want to touch on the idea of the donation bin as a form of procrastination. Sometimes I tell myself I am going to find a good home for something as a way to avoid making the final decision to let it go. It is a way to stay in the middle ground where I don't have the clutter, but I also don't have the guilt. It's purgatory for peripherals.
It is a holding pattern. It is the inventory equivalent of leaving a browser tab open because you might read it later. You are just offloading the decision to your future self. The problem is that your future self is going to be just as busy, just as tired, and just as prone to the altruistic tax as your current self. You are just compounding the interest on that mental debt. Every day that keyboard sits there, it's a to-do item that you haven't checked off.
So what is the framework for Daniel? He has got the tech background, he is in Israel, he has a young son Ezra and a wife Hannah. His time is incredibly valuable. How does he cut through the noise and reclaim his office?
Step 1 is to set a hard floor for individual sales or donations. For someone in Daniel's position, I would suggest that floor be quite high. If an item is worth less than $50, it does not get an individual listing, period. No exceptions. If it's a $15 keyboard, it's below the floor.
$50 is a lot for a keyboard or a basic microphone. That means almost all of his tech clutter would fall below that line. He'd be clearing out 90% of his to-do pile instantly.
That is the point. Most of it is not worth the altruistic tax. Step 2 is to identify a single, high-efficiency exit ramp. Find one organization or one local person who takes bulk donations of functional tech and becomes your go-to. You don't shop around for recipients. You don't look for the perfect student. You have a single pipe that you pour your excess into. In Israel, there are often schools in the periphery or community centers in South Tel Aviv that have a constant need for tech. If Daniel can find one reliable contact there, he can just drop a box off once a quarter. That turns 100 decisions into 4 decisions a year.
Step 3 is the hardest one, embracing the trash can for low-value, high-friction items. If an item is outdated, like an old VGA cable or a first-generation webcam, just throw it away. Do not try to be the hero who saves every circuit board. Your mental health and your ability to be present with Ezra and Hannah are more important than the small chance that someone might find a use for a 10-year-old cable.
I think there is also something to be said for the joy of a clean slate. When you finally get rid of that shelf of old peripherals, the room actually feels bigger. It is not just the physical space, it is the visual noise that stops. Every time you look at that shelf, your brain is doing a check on those items. When the shelf is empty, that check returns a null value, and your brain can move on to something more important.
I love the idea of reframing the trash can as a tool for mental health. It is not an act of waste. It is an act of reclaiming your bandwidth. It is saying, I value my time and my focus more than I value the theoretical utility of this object. It's an act of self-respect.
And if you really want to be altruistic, take the time you save by not coordinating that keyboard pickup and use it to contribute to an open source project or to help a friend with a technical problem. That is a much higher value form of altruism than being a part-time, unpaid delivery driver for old hardware. You are a software expert, Daniel. Don't spend your life doing low-level hardware logistics.
We should also mention the professional organizer's perspective on the trash category. They often say that if you haven't used an item in a year, and it doesn't have deep sentimental value, it is already trash. It just hasn't reached the bin yet. Keeping it is just a form of delayed disposal. You're just acting as a temporary warehouse for the landfill.
It is about closing the loops. Every unused item is an open loop in your brain. Closing those loops by getting the items out of your house by whatever means is fastest is a gift to your future self. It's like clearing the cache of your physical life.
I want to talk about the future for a second. We are seeing more AI-driven inventory management and automated marketplaces. Do you think we will eventually have a solution where an AI just handles the altruistic tax for us? Like, I put a box out and the drone picks it up and figures out who needs it.
We are getting closer. There are already services in some cities where you can just put a bag of stuff out and they handle the sorting and donation for a small fee. That is essentially paying someone to take on the altruistic tax for you. For many people, that is a fantastic investment. But until that is widespread, especially in places with more complex logistics like Israel, we have to be our own efficiency experts. We have to be the CEOs of our own homes. A CEO doesn't spend 3 hours deciding what to do with a $15 keyboard. They make a policy and they move on.
The policy is the key. You don't want to be making these decisions one by one. You want a system. If item equals low value and item equals unused, then item goes to the big box. No thinking required. No guilt required.
Daniel, I hope this helps you feel a bit less guilty about that trash bag. You have fought the good fight with the Israeli Customs Office enough times. You don't need to fight it again just to get rid of the stuff. Focus on the high-value work and the time with your family. The keyboards will find their way to the landfill or the recycling center, and the world will keep turning. Your bandwidth is the most precious thing you own.
I'm going to go look at my K20 keyboard now and see if I can finally follow our own advice. It has been a loyal companion. It's helped me write a lot of scripts, but I think its time in my life has come to an end. It's time to close that loop.
Just remember, Corn, the moment it hits the bottom of the bin, you will feel a weight lift that you didn't even realize you were carrying. It's the weight of maybe. And maybe is a very heavy thing to carry.
Before we wrap up, I want to give a quick shout out to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes and making sure we don't hoard too many old audio takes.
And a big thanks to Madal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We couldn't do this deep dive into the altruistic tax without that support.
If you found this discussion helpful, or if you're currently staring at a pile of old cables you can't bring yourself to toss, we would love to hear from you. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for all the ways to subscribe and listen.
We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts. We promise not to clutter your notifications.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our